Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Y Pod, where we highlight everyday Wyoming leaders. Excited today to have a conversation with John Woodward. John, thanks for doing this with us today.
Thank you very much.
And as a place to start, if you would, before we dive into the Wyoming Veterans Memorial Museum, which is what we're going to talk about for most of the conversation, could you tell us a little bit about your personal background?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm a Central Wyoming native. I was born and raised in Riverton. My family has a long connection with the state of Wyoming. First branches of my family arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1872 in the small town of Tice Siding, just south of Laramie. I attended the University of Wyoming with getting a trio of degrees in anthropology and history. I got my master's in 2010, and then spent some time looking for a way to use my degree in the professional setting. I moved out to Nebraska for 2.5 years and served as the museum director at the Dawson County Historical Museum in Lexington, Nebraska, telling the story of the Platte Valley. After that, I relocated, thankfully, back to Wyoming and served as the museum director for the Sheridan County Historical Society and Museum up in Sheridan for 4 years before coming to Casper just shy of 2 years ago. So I've be 2 years in July. So I'm one of the people that came back. Thankfully, had the opportunity to come back.
And before we click the red record button, you were saying that it was a very conscious choice on your part to come back. It wasn't accidental.
No, that was one thing. I learned very quickly when I lived in Nebraska that I missed the mountains. I mean, there are some very tall hills in Nebraska, but there are no mountains. And I've always lived in a place where there are mountains anchoring at least one side of the horizon. So I wanted to come back. My family still lives here. My parents still live in Riverton, and I wanted to be closer to them. A lot of my friends still live in the state, so I started working to find an opportunity to come back to Wyoming, and was thankful that I was able to get the opportunity.
And your first step back was in Sheridan, but the focus of our conversation today is the adventure you're on now. Could you tell us a little bit about, just big picture for people who might not be familiar with it, the Wyoming Veterans Memorial Museum, and I'll put up a visual of the building itself while you do that.
All right, so the Wyoming Veterans Memorial Museum is part of the Wyoming Military Department, Wyoming National Guard. We are part of 2 museums and a network of gallery spaces across the state of Wyoming. Our museum here in Casper has a history dating back to the late 1990s. It was founded originally as a nonprofit and then slowly transitioned to a state museum in the mid to early 2000s. Starting in 2008, it became part of the military department, and we're administered under the Wyoming Veterans Commission. But the story of the museum and the story of really goes back to the 1940s. In 1941, the Army Air Forces began scouting out survey locations in Wyoming for a new air base. And this was even before Pearl Harbor. And they decided on a location here in central Wyoming. After Pearl Harbor, construction began on the Casper Army Air Base that started in June of 1942 and was completed by the beginning of September. We actually began training bomber crews here at the Casper Army Air Base starting in November of 1942, and that continued until February of 1945. About 16,000 men passed through Casper on their ways to the European and Pacific theaters. We trained at first B-17 crews and then later B-24. Of the 400 original buildings that were created during the war, about 90 of them are still present here at the airport, including our building, Building 141, which was the Enlisted Men's Service Club. And so I like to tell our visitors that as they're coming into the museum, they are entering our largest artifact.
So the building itself, John, being part of the display is a really unique and cool feature. Inside, there's a display actually talking about some of the pieces that you just talked about, and also a visual display, because when you say 400 buildings, it's hard for me to even fathom.
Absolutely. So within the building, we really have two focuses. Our main mission is to tell the story of Wyoming's veterans, uh, mostly from the Spanish-American War to the present day. The other focus, the other part of our mission, is to tell the story of the Casper Army Air Base. So the image that you're sharing with your visitors or your audience right now is of our Wings of Freedom exhibit that just opened this past January, and explores the history of the Casper Army Air Base from its inception to the transition to civilian ownership, and eventually the use by the Wyoming Air National Guard into the 1960s. The airport itself, the Casper Natrona County Airport that we know today, the large part of it came from the airbase. The runways, the apron, the hangars, they all had their foundation in that wartime construction in 1942. A lot of the buildings, the hangars along the flight line that you can see today, like Soaring Aviation or Atlantic, those large hangar buildings, they were built in 1942.
And to have that historical perspective and to stand on the ground where all those soldiers were and just imagine how different things must have been. The visualization that you do is a part of it. There are also other displays that obviously we can only scratch the surface on what you have inside the museum, but there's so many different ways to look back into that history. I'm not a really strong history buff like my wife is, but even for me, looking at these photos and hearing you tell the stories, it's something folks really need to see in order to experience.
Absolutely.
Shifting to a slightly different exhibit that tells a different part of the story, what are folks seeing when they see these?
All right, so these are actually two parts of two different exhibits. So on our Doughboy statue is the Victorious American Doughboy by Avard T. Fairbanks. It's a miniature of a larger statue that's outside of the state, but that's part of our World War I exhibit. Last November, we refreshed our World War I exhibit cases to include the story, talk a little bit more about the First World War. This particular statue was donated by a gentleman who's from the northern Wyoming, Sheridan area, Dr. David Fairbanks, who's the grandson of the artist. But the thing to think about is, yes, we are a veterans museum. A lot of our visitors think we are a history museum, but there's so much more to telling a veteran story than just militaria. We have veterans who are artists, photographers, authors. Their works were inspired in part or in whole by their experiences in uniform, or at least, or how they, so, we don't have limits on what stories we tell or how we tell them. So incorporating art is a big part of what I'm driving for in the future, so we can have, we can appeal to different aspects and different audiences.
It almost sounds like you're using it as a platform or as a pivot point to tell a wide variety of stories.
Absolutely. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, it's another exhibit. It's part of our Casper Army Air Base exhibit, but it tells a story of Joy Kading, who is actually the sort of our founder. Mrs. Kading served as the stenographer for the first engineering crew that came to Casper to begin building the airbase, and then she stayed on as a civilian employee throughout the base's entire history, serving as the secretary and stenographer for a series of base commanders. Afterwards, she was instrumental in preserving the history of the airbase, establishing the museum, and eventually getting the airbase grounds added to the National Register of Historic Places. So she is instrumental in preserving and making sure that without her, I would not be here today.
And none of us would have these stories to tell or stories to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of stories, I think your biggest challenge on this one is, you mentioned there are so many stories you could tell out of this. So dealer's choice, what do you want to talk about here, John?
So I don't think there is anything more controversial in Wyoming history than the talking about the bucking horse logo that we all know and love. I I will fully admit that I have personal opinions and I have the research to back some of those up. But one of my favorite collections, this goes back to our World War I exhibit, is about Sheridan County veteran George Nicholas Ostrom. Mr. Ostrom was born in Iowa in the late 19th century and then moved to Sheridan County in the 19 teens. He joined the Wyoming Army National Guard right before World War I. And after serving in 1916 and early 1917 as part of the Mexican border dispute, he and the Wyoming Guard were federalized and sent along the Mexican border. They came back and were federalized about 3 weeks later for federal service in France. And he became part of the 148th Field Artillery. Now, Mr. Ostrom was a very good artist. After the war, as part of the Army of Occupation after the armistice, he designed the bucking horse logo for the 148th Field Artillery to use to adorn their equipment, their vehicles, and their helmet, as you can see, commemorative pieces like the humidor that we have on exhibit. And so that was sort of the first recognizable bucking horse that we see today. It's noticeably different than the bucking horse logo that's used by the university, by the state of Wyoming, and there's actually another version that's used by the Wyoming Air National Guard that actually has a four-legged horse. There are several different versions. I will defer to the explanation that Secretary of State, then later Governor Lester Hunt, provided, along with the artist Alan Tupper True, that our bucking horse is a composite of many different ones. That might get me into trouble. I mean, as a Fremont County native, people are going to say I better support Stub Farlow, but that's another story. I have some family connections to this story too, that many people are familiar with one of the other claimants, Guy Holt. I actually happen to be his great grandson, so there's a family connection there too. But I like to go with what Governor Hunt and Alan True had with the story of the bucking horse.
Well, and you and I were talking before we started recording. You said there are even more stories to this. So for those people who physically visit the museum, this is something to ask about, because there's a lot of conversation to be had here. And I appreciate how well you navigated all that, John. I don't think you started any border wars there.
I hope not. I've had to thread the needle on that several times, so I have my elevator speech well and duly prepared.
Good for you, John. It's part of the job. Now, with less controversy, I assume, involved, but again, you said many stories involved with the big stick.
All right, so the big stick, this is part of the Bill Sykes collection here at the museum. Bill has a connection to Casper and a connection both with the European and Pacific theaters. As part of a B-17 crew, Bill came to Casper, trained here at the Casper Army Air Base, and flew 25 missions in B-17s over Europe. Most of those were in the B-17 with the nickname Sizzle. After doing 25 missions in Europe, he came back to the United States, and after some arguments with the Army Air Forces, managed to be retrained as a B-29 pilot and flew additional missions in the Pacific theater. And his plane in the Pacific was the Big Stick. The logo or the nose art that you can see both in the image hanging on the door and also in the display case was designed by Walt Disney. So this is one of those stories. And then on the top, you can see a video playing from it's a World War II cartoon, Private Snafu, and we teach the importance of censoring letters so you don't get yourself in trouble with with operational security.
And so many facets in terms of how military life was woven into popular culture in the time in different ways than it is now.
Oh, absolutely. So it isn't shown on the TV, but we have a rotating list of World War II cartoons. The other one we show on that reel is an aerial gunnery instructional video, and it was produced by the same folks that were making Looney Tunes. Same voices, the same artistic style. I mean, during World War II, Hollywood got behind the war effort and were producing instructional movies, all sorts of things. It was a truly national effort, and that's something we like to highlight for people that might not be aware of those little fun facts.
And speaking as someone who has both been a young person, like a kid who was brought by his parents into a museum, and also someone who's taken his kids into a museum, the idea that there's a cartoon somewhere in the museum could be a saving grace for folks making the trip and wanting to give their kids something to take out of it.
Well, absolutely. It gives, obviously it's something that immediately grabs the attention of our younger visitors, but at the same time, it relates back, we have multiple generations of Americans today that grew up watching cartoons. I mean, not to date my father, but he could remember watching Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in the movie theater in Jackson, Wyoming. So, I mean, there are so many generations, and so we'll see grandfathers and grandsons sitting there watching the cartoon right next to each other. They're able to share that experience, which I think is very special.
Absolutely, it is. Also gives me a chance to mention for folks who are watching this and thinking about physically going, John and I were talking before we started recording about how many different audiences you talk to and interact with, and the ability and necessity really to adjust to each of those audiences. The way you talk to a group of grade school kids is not the same way that you talk to a group of adults.
Oh, absolutely. All of it is based upon their frame of reference. With younger elementary school students, a lot of what we focus on is, what is a veteran? What does it mean to be a veteran? Identifying the different service branches, up to and including, the National Guard and now the new Space Force. So, we talk about those, and then that way we can segue into looking at the different conflicts and the different veterans and how they served. For an adult, there's a lot more personal relations between a veteran and themselves, because, up until the 1970s, there were far more veterans in society. So, brothers, sisters, uncles, parents, we all have somebody that served in the military at some point in the past. My dad, for example, served in the Wyoming Air National Guard. I had a pair of great uncles that fought in World War II. So, I mean, when they look at those collections, they begin to see their family member who served in that particular conflict. So every audience has a different experience. For our veterans, that there's a real tangible experience because they can relate directly back to those experiences. Whether that's our Korean War vets, our World War II vets, Vietnam veterans, or some of our later conflicts, they see themselves and see their experiences reflected in our exhibits.
Speaking of the different exhibits, there are so many things to talk about, but just a few highlights or snippets from the museum that we wanted to cover. What are folks seeing in this display?
So this is a collection that we have on loan from the Sheridan County Museum. This is the Edmund G. Geyer collection. This is actually some of the oldest collection we have in the museum. This is the Spanish-American War. Sergeant Major Geyer, served in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, right, 1898 to 1899. He was from the Sheridan area, and he brought back quite a few souvenirs, both of his wartime service and of serving in the Philippines. So this is one of those stories that we like to tell, because this was the first time as a state that Wyoming, even though this wasn't a National Guard formation, this was the first time that Wyoming as a state sent a large group of soldiers overseas in national defense.
In the history of how far back it goes, you said from the Spanish-American War all the way through. Now on the screen here, they're going to see something that I didn't understand when I first saw it. But there's a massive part of the museum that people see, but they don't necessarily even recognize what they're seeing.
So I like to describe museums as an iceberg. Only a small portion of the items that are donated to the museum are ever visible to the public at one time. Most of our collections are held in offsite storage or on-site storage. And then as we develop new exhibits, we'll pull items out for, to put in. But a big part of our job is collection stewardship. We've been entrusted with these items, and so we use some of the best practices developed to make sure that they are safely stored, safely kept, safely maintained, so they aren't lost. And that's everything from paper documents, photographs, motion pictures, maps. But what you see on the screen here is a collection that came in several weeks ago, and it's a World War II era engine tooling kit. These are specifically part of timing gauges and different things for engines. So when we're not working with the public, or we're not always creating new exhibits, a lot of what we do is collection stewardship. We'll bring items in, we'll make sure that they're we have them numbered. That's what you can see, the catalog numbers on all of the items. And then afterwards we enter them into a computer database so we can better keep track of them. So in some part we're an educational entity, in some part we are I wouldn't quite say recreation, but we provide a space for people to come out and explore the past in a creative and fun way. But on the flip side of that, we're also in some ways like a warehouse and an inventory control center, making sure that we control and maintain all of the items that have been entrusted into our care.
When you use words like entrusted, it resonates with the way you talked about it before we were recording, that the idea that you take very seriously the responsibility that you have in terms of having all these items. And it leads me to ask a question, which is if a family member of a veteran has material possessions from when those veterans served, do you accept donations? Is there a process for that to happen, or for you to be considered as a resting place for these items?
So in short, yes, we do accept donations, but we do have some guidelines that we use to ensure that what we're taking in is able to be cared for. Probably our biggest guideline is that the veteran has to have a Wyoming connection. Specifically, that we say that they have to have at some point in their life been a Wyoming resident or a Wyoming native, either born in the state or achieved residency here at some point in their lives. As the Wyoming Veterans Memorial Museum, that we will occasionally get collections from out of state, and unfortunately we have to turn those down because without that Wyoming connection, we really can't tell that story. And there are some items that we don't accept, either because we have too many of them or that they are too hard to maintain and care for. So for anyone who is interested in making a donation, definitely give us a call. We'd love to sit down and talk to you, explain what our donation process is like and what the different steps are.
I'm just imagining you being approached by someone about a possession they have, or as with the art earlier, something that a family member has held on to that has an heirloom significance to them. It must be one of the more fascinating parts of your job, these discoveries that come your way.
Absolutely. And a large part of that comes actually as we're doing the initial inventory. The items will come in. Obviously, we have no idea what might walk through our door next. But the big part is doing the research and finding out what the item is. We try very hard to maintain the story of that veteran with those items. and to place that in the proper context. So, for example, with our timing gauges, these were donated as part of, or to be used with our World War II fire engine, which is currently undergoing renovations. I mean, the fire engine itself was used here at the air base, and these are examples of some of the tools that would have been used to maintain it at the time. Another part of this collection was a low voltage circuit tester that today would have been the size of your cellular telephone, but at that point was about as big as a bread box. But you know, having that story, we want to be able to tell the story, and that's, you know, as we're talking to the donor, it's making sure that we get all the information about, you know, their uncle, their aunt, their grandfather, their great uncle, their great aunt. You know, what did they do? Where did they serve? What were their experiences? Because when we take those objects and we put them into an exhibit, having that story really brings that person, that whole thing to life. Without it, we can tell the story about the objects, but it's not the same. It's not being able to tell a fully fleshed out story about a veteran and their experiences.
It's one of the things that I hope people recognize as a unique feature, partially because we're in Wyoming and we don't have the massive population that folks suffer from, I'll say, in other places around the country and around the world, is the ability that when they come to visit you, and I hope folks do come visit the location, when they come visit you, they get to hear those stories. And it's not just a plaque that's on the wall next to it and you read for a couple of minutes and then you move to the next item and you read for a couple of moments. It seems as though you and your other staff member have so many of those stories in your head, and you really seem to enjoy sharing those stories.
You know, working with the public is one of the joys of my job, whether that's presenting to a group of fifth graders or, you know, having a group of retirees come through the museum. Once upon a time, I wanted to be a game show host. I know that might seem strange, but I like working with the public. I like being able to tell stories. A museum is in many ways a forum to tell stories, whether that's I don't want to say I'm a professional storyteller, because but that's a big part of what we do when we interact with the public.
And for those folks who are thinking that we just scratched the surface, you'd be absolutely right. There's so much in the building, and the exhibits change, the displays change. As you said, you're working on refurbishing different pieces, and I know from talking to you that you rotate different exhibits through. What you'll see on the screen in front of you now is the Casper location. The reason I say it that way is, John, you mentioned earlier that there is another museum that you're responsible for in all your spare time. There's a location in Cheyenne that you're responsible for. So for anyone who happens to have the ability to get to Cheyenne in addition to, or more easily than Casper, there's a museum there as well. And this location in Casper, even for Casper residents, there are probably a lot of us who live in Casper who have never even been to the museum. So I'd very strongly encourage people to physically go to the museums and visit. John, if folks wanted to stay in touch with what you're doing, I know you have a Facebook presence. Is that the best way for folks to stay in touch with what you're doing?
Absolutely. So our Facebook page, we're updating it more or less weekly. Last few weeks, we've been putting up our collection snapshot videos, just highlighting little fun items that we've been finding. We do have an email list, and you can sign up for that on our Facebook page. Right now, the museum, we're under some slightly modified hours, but we are open 5 days a week, Tuesday through Saturday, from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to give us a call. You can get our contact information off of our website or our Facebook page. Or if not, feel free to drop by and we'd be happy to chat with you.
Well, John, thanks for giving us a little bit of insight into the museum. And again, I know we just scratched the surface. We didn't touch Cheyenne at all. But thanks for what you're doing to keep these memories and these stories alive. I really appreciate what you do.
Thank you very much.